Freedom, independence and equality, tackling the big issues. The big issues are as prevalent in historical fiction as they are in our own day, and raise passionate convictions in many ways and in many debates. Also, quite frequently, historical fictions affect and might even influence reader opinions in our own time, whether this is valid or wise or not. Doug Jackson is an ideal person to lead this panel for us. He's a much fated novelist with 2 highly successful series of Roman-based fiction that very much tackle big issues, the corruption, imperial power, duty. He also has more than a weather eye on the present, having been a career journalist for 36 years. And now he's also writing contemporary thrillers under the name of James Douglas. It also will not escape you, I think, that he's Scottish, and that nation has a mighty big vote to take in a week or 2. Now, I absolutely don't want to put you on the spot or anyone on the spot about that, Doug, but the vote is a very easy example of how the past and how historical fiction, and remember that historical fiction sort of starts in a way with Walter Scott, and it's always about these kind of issues, might possibly influence present thinking and thereby the future. It's not just historical fiction, it's for our time too. Ladies and gentlemen, Douglas Jackson.
Thank you, Richard. We propose to start off the panel with, I'll ask a couple of questions, but we'll come out to the audience, I think, quite a lot, because this is a very, very broad subject, and I'd really like to get your view of it as much as ours. First of all, I'll ask the panel to introduce themselves, beginning with Elizabeth.
Oh, I'm Elizabeth Fremantle. I write 16th century set novels. First novel, Queen's Gambit, is about Catherine Parr, and I've got another one out at the moment about the 2 younger sisters of Lady Jane Grey, Sisters of Treason, and I've just delivered the 3rd in the Tudor trilogy, which is about Penelope Devereux, sister of the Earl of Essex. My focus is on women, and women in some way trying to find a voice and seeking to in some way take control of their own lives in a time when that was very, very difficult. So that's me.
I'm Emma Darwin. I can never answer the what period do you write, because my first novel, The Mathematics of Love, was half set in 1819 and half set in 1976, and that was a painfully wide straddle, so I made it worse next, because my second novel, A Secret Alchemy, was half set in The Wars of the Roses and half set in 1995. So I can never answer that question. Maybe more relevant here is that I'm just at the moment working on a book for Hodder as part of their Teach Yourself Creative Writing series, which is Get Started in Writing Historical Fiction. So I got my ears open for that. In terms of writing, is maybe what how I've described my books suggests. I'm very interested in our sense of time and history. You know, that in the time that we exist in, that's present to us, but we're also aware of what's behind us. And I think that fits into our discussion about, you know, big issues, where you locate big issues, because of course you're always mapping to and fro. And also things of women and all sorts of stuff also come up along the way.
Thank you. Margaret?
Yes, my name is Margaret George, and I have written 6 novels that span from 1200 BC through the Elizabethan era. I do have 3 Tudor era ones, one about Elizabeth I, one about Henry VIII, and another about Mary Queen of Scots. But I also have done one about Helen of Troy, Cleopatra, and Mary Magdalene. And I would call them psychobiographies, because everybody knows what they did. But what we really want to know is, why did they do it? And what were they thinking? And also, of course, the whole business about independence. Even though these people had tremendous power, with the exception of Mary Magdalene, they weren't all that free. They certainly influenced their era, but their era also had a stranglehold on them. And I think the whole thing about your personal life and how does it translate into public affairs. They had a unique opportunity to have what made them go affect a lot of other people, which is a huge responsibility. So that's my main focus.
Hi, I'm Robyn Young. I started writing really very young because it grew out of a love of reading, which I was lucky enough to be taught when I was 3 by my father. So the two very much came together for me, the world of words on the page that I enjoyed, and then the world that I wanted to then go away and create myself. I wrote 2 fantasy novels in my early 20s, which thankfully are still in a sock drawer and will ever so remain. And then I did a creative writing master's at Sussex University, and I remember one of the first things that my tutor at the time said was, write what you know. So I immediately entered the mindset of a 13-year-old Scot going off to fight in the Crusades with a big sword. And 7 years later, because I didn't study history, so this was very much a learning curve for me, I finished the first in what would become the Brethren trilogy, which were about the Knights Templar on the eve of the Crusades, or the eve of the last Crusades. And from that springboarded quite naturally my Insurrection trilogy, which is about Robert Bruce, essentially, and the Wars of Independence, which might have some vague topicality going on today. That's me.
Andrew?
Hi, my name's Andrew Taylor. I suppose I'm a fraud, really, in the sense that I feel I shouldn't quite be here. I began as a contemporary crime novelist. I'm still really a crime novelist, but in the last sort of 10 or 15 years of writing, I've wandered increasingly into the past. I've set a series in the 1950s. I've set one-off novels in the 1930s and the Regency period. And my last 3 novels have been set in the 18th century. What particularly interests me in writing novels set in the past is not just the as it were, the physicality of the past, you know, the clothes, the carriages, the politics and so on, but it's more the sort of psychological furniture that people had inside their minds. Why did they think as they thought? What did they believe and why? And how did that influence what they did? Doug.
Thank you. So that's our distinguished panellists, and now on to the subject. I have to admit that when I saw the title of this panel, my first reaction was panic. Freedom and independence and equality, they aren't just big issues, they're huge fundamental issues. But when I thought about it a little bit more, I realised that as novelists, we all probably deal with those fundamentals just about every day through the lives of our characters. When I was writing the book that became Caligula, I came to understand that Rufus, the slave through whose eyes we see the times, probably had more of what we would think of as freedom as the emperor who he served. Caligula was trapped in a gilded cage and chained by a need to outdo the feats of the great men that he followed. He had the power to do almost anything, but power isn't the same as freedom. The Roman historian Tacitus sets himself up as a defender of freedom and independence, if not equality, when he puts words into the mouths of men like the Caledonian leader Calgacus and the German king Arminius. And of his own time he wrote, as a former age had witnessed the extreme of liberty, so we witnessed the extreme of servitude. So he knew a few things about freedom and independence and equality. As writers, we all write about different eras and from different perspectives. Do you think that freedom, independence and equality as concepts have different interpretations in different eras? And if so, how do they manifest themselves in your own era? You want to kick us off, Elizabeth?
Okay. Oh, my head's aching with the idea of it. I think I quite like to start from a more narrow perspective on things. I get very daunted by the idea of these huge ideas. And so for me, my kind of way into looking at those ideas that all exist in my novels is is to look at lives of individuals and see to what extent they were free. And, you know, I was interested in Margaret's comment about some of the Tudor rulers, and also you talking about Caligula, how that idea, I thought particularly of Elizabeth I, she wasn't free. She had no freedom. She was limited firstly by her gender and this decision, this sort of prolonged decision not to marry. You know, that is kind of symbolic in some way of what all women's lives were. And she was less free than other monarchs because she was female. And I think Mary Tudor is another example of that. That women's lives were small. They were not expected to engage with the big issues. Those were men's things for men to deal with. There was no notion of equality for women. They didn't even strive for it. It wasn't until centuries later that women kind of got together and they thought, should we have equality with men? It was apparently the word of God that women weren't equal, and that was accepted. And it's very hard. I found that something very hard when I was engaging initially with writing about a woman like Catherine Parr, who's the protagonist of my first novel, because she's an articulate woman, highly intelligent, an author, highly educated, and yet she accepts that she's a lesser being than any man around her. How is this possible? And I found I had to look at religious beliefs about women not being equal and women not having freedom, so that their lives, they accept that their lives are dictated by men. And so I think it's interesting to sort of try and look at contemporary examples. I think the lives of many Islamic women living in fundamentalist societies, they're very like the lives of Tudor women, and that helps me to understand the way though their freedoms are so limited. I'm going to pass on to Emma before I start waffling.
Yes, I think that's true. And I mean, it is a problem if you want women as your protagonists. I mean, apart from cynically the fact that the majority of readers are women, readers of fiction are women, it's also, it is also that the power of fiction to write on the white spaces in history. It is about reclaiming silent, lives that haven't been written. That's often the motivation, that we look at the gap in the written history and think, what was it like in there? That's blank, that's space for me. But then one of the reasons it's blank is because there's maybe not an awful lot going on in there. And we have to find that. I mean, I found it, particularly in my second novel, A Secret Alchemy, which is, it's all about marriage, and that, sadly that sounds boring, but it's about how these partnerships work. And I think one thing you have to think is that the real human drive for most of us is to survive within the milieu we're in. It not only is historically unconvincing to turn every 15th century woman into a feminist, and every 15th century man you want the reader to like into a feminist while we're at it, but it's also not terribly interesting, because actually what most of us do most of the time is try and find the place between the conventions and what we really are, where we can operate in some kind of place of reasonable fulfillment, reasonable happiness, and reasonable survival. And I find myself particularly writing the marriage between Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville, which is at the centre of A Secret Alchemy. When you really look at it, when you read new biographies that are not written by her enemies, was clearly a partnership that worked, and it worked in an extremely pragmatic way. And they had both been brought up as landed gentry. She'd been brought up as the wife of a knight, and he was a knight, roughly speaking. He was a bit grander than her. And so, how does that work? It obviously did work. And I wanted to portray a marriage that did work, despite these boundaries that we recognise. And that was as interesting to me, in fact, probably more interesting as a writer, than it was to make her be terribly downtrodden because she didn't have the vote. Or whatever. I'm being very unfair. But anyway.
Thank you. Margaret.
Well, I am going to be writing a book about the Emperor Nero. It's not finished yet. And as odd as it sounds, he really wanted to be free of all these constraints. He really wanted to do his acting and his poetry and his music and basically get out of the box of what was expected as an emperor. He actually thought of himself primarily as an artist who just happened to have this day job as emperor. Well, that's what did him in, actually, because of course it was completely unrealistic. You think of the emperor as having all this power, but he didn't have power to be allowed to do what really he wanted to do. And then the same thing with Elizabeth I. She, in order to have as much freedom as she possibly could, which still isn't a lot, but she at least was able to say no to the marriage thing.
Yeah.
And in order to do that, in order to be as independent as she could, she had to have the courage to say no to that one big thing that was really expected of her, realizing that, okay, there's not going to be an heir to the throne. I'm going to leave the succession actually in the hands of fate, because who knew who was going to be available by the time it was needed? I mean, people died right and left all the time from illnesses. And so you're saying, whatever is going to happen, it's more important to me to have my autonomy now. I will not put myself under the rule of a man. And the other thing that struck me is that they had so little freedom then, until recently, because of all these illnesses. Medicine was so primitive, and you were just struck down all the time by things like, Prince Albert dying of typhoid, and another queen dying of a ruptured hernia, and Princess Charlotte in the Georgian era dying. And so you really were at the mercy of biology then, much more than you are now too. And of course there's nothing you could do about that at the time. So freedom and equality and independence are so fluid, and usually you don't get all three of them together, at least not in these earlier eras.
I think for me, what interested me most was really Robert's story, and Robert Bruce's story for the Insurrection trilogy, because the idea of independence for Scotland at that time really was not there. It was born out of the first Scottish wars of independence, and Robert was very much at the heart of that, and to a point where I find the question of do we think about independence the same way now as you would 700 years ago, and that's where I think it gets sort of a bit dangerous to hook modern notions of that onto the past. And I was actually quite appalled when it was mooted first that the SNP wanted to have the referendum on the 700th anniversary of the Battle of Bannockburn, which completely, I mean, it's very clever from a propaganda point of view, and a sort of pulling of the heartstrings, but it totally whitewashes over the complexity of the original struggle. And Robert, for me, really embodies that complexity, because he started off fighting on the English side, and then switched sides. It was 3 times during the course of the conflict. And for me, it was sort of Robert the man. Well, starting off as I begin the book when he's 11, so I sort of follow his journey. And for me, the struggle for Scotland's independence at that time, even though it was very much a sort of germ of an idea, was as much Robert's own sort of struggle for independence within his family, who at that time were feudally tied to Edward I, which meant that when war broke out, he was supposed to be on the English side. So as much as it became a sort of a national struggle, it was very much began for me when I was reading the history as one man's struggle. So it's sort of, again, we're talking about the narrowing of these great big concepts and ideas, and sort of then following that down through the lives of our characters. I'm really interested about the question of women, because, you go back to this period, the 13th and 14th centuries, and women are ghosts in the narrative. Their voices are mere whispers, and it was very, very difficult for me to find some strong women. I mean, they literally could only turn up in book 3. It was very hard to find women I could follow, because also if I'm doing war here, it's women are more the victims of war than the instigators, and they're very rarely taken to a battlefield with obvious reasons why. And at the times where women were there in the middle of a conflict, awful things happened to them. Awful things were happening to the men as well on a battlefield. But yes, I'm really interested in how you find those sorts of lost voices of particularly women in these roles, and the issue of equality, which there's this one memorable moment where Robert's second wife, who becomes Queen of Scotland, Elizabeth de Burgh, when he takes the crown, there's a sort of famous moment where she chastises him for that and says, you're just playing at kings and queens here, because when he seized the crown, it was by rebellion and murder, not through any sort of political process. And I put that scene into the book, and I gave her a bit more fire, and she actually sort of really challenges Robert rather than just sort of says, oh, you're just playing at kings and queens. Because the Wars of Independence was so complex, and because I did really want to get the history as right as possible, even though there are these huge gaps of knowledge, I paid a historian, a specialist in the period, to read the manuscript, and when he got to that scene, he said there is just no way that this woman would have, harangued her husband, the king, like that at this moment. He said, I cannot believe that this would have happened. So I had to literally strip out all of the fire from that argument, because I felt, well, if I'm paying him to tell me what he thinks, and I do want it to be plausible as well. And certainly from all of the reading that I did, women were certainly very constrained, and to a point where you hardly ever hear them in the accounts.
Although the accounts and the facts are different.
Well, yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I think there's at least a partial consensus emerging, isn't it, that the way to approach notions of freedom and equality and independence is actually through the individual, through the personal. And that's true whether we're talking about slavery or women, questions of race, true right the way around. For me, I can never even begin. I can't think in terms of these huge concepts.
Yeah.
It never works for me. I have to find, I think what a speaker in the previous panel said, was sort of the way in, the chink that will allow me to sort of find a way into the story set in a particular time in history. In my last novel, The Silent Boy, which is set in the French Revolution, I did so much reading about the French Revolution beforehand, and I just couldn't make it work as a story. I knew I wanted to have the central character in my previous novel, who's a rather world-weary English civil servant. I knew he had to come into it. But I couldn't find a clue to the story until almost out of nowhere came a mute boy. And the novel is called The Silent Boy because of that. And I started writing with no idea of the plan from the point of view of a mute boy, maybe 11 years old, who has seen something on the 11th of August 1792, which was the day, or rather the night in Paris, when the streets literally ran red with blood, because that was the night the mob stormed the Tuileries. And I had the precise day, and I had this boy who'd seen or heard something that had been so terrible, it had forced him to shut down his powers of speech. So half the book was actually written from the point of view of this boy who couldn't speak, and also he was a child in an adult's world, and indeed a world where children were there to be squashed, seen but not heard, or just sent around, and they had to do what they were told. They were not expected to sort of act as independent human beings with opinions of their own. So he was completely powerless, completely unequal, completely unindependent. And it was his story that allowed me to inhabit that particular period. And in fact, most of it was set in England rather than Paris and in the English countryside. But for me, it always has to be the voice of one particular character that leads me into the story, whatever the larger themes may end up being.
Thank you. As writers, we're free to do with what we like with our characters, to write about any subject we see fit in the way that we choose. All of your books have tackled big issues and times of personal or political upheaval at one point or another. Have you ever come across an area or a subject that made you shy away, that actually made you, that is taboo for you?
I did. I actually changed the plot of The Mathematics of Love after feedback from my agent. And because I had a relation, there was a small boy in the modern strand of it who was slightly mysterious. You didn't quite know, he seemed to be just kind of stray and living in the house. And it turned out that he was the product of mother-son incest. I wanted somebody incredibly sort of rootless. It's almost a ghost story. He's so in such a strange place that he's hardly even anchored in his own century. There is a small boy in the other strand, whether it's the same or not, I don't know. And so in order to make it be the product of the whole novel is about transgressive sex, and that was the most transgressive thing I could think of. And my agent, it was actually the conversation when we were having a conversation about whether she was going to become my agent, which was the point at which I decided yes. Because what she said was, I don't think this works. And for two reasons, and one is commercial, so I distrust it, which is that this is the one kind of incest you really cannot do. It is box office death. Yeah. And she said, and the other reason is because it doesn't work. Because actually it was quite a minor point in the story, and it is such a huge issue that it's kind of one of those issues that's either got to be the point of the story or you don't have it. Yeah, it took up far too much space in that very last bit when actually you're trying to bring the really important bits together very clearly. So I changed it. Yeah, I suppose that means that was one big issue I dodged, you could say.
How did you feel about it, change that?
I was convinced because she had both those reasons, and I also knew she was right. If she just said you can't do it, it's not nice, I might not have. But also because she is a fabulous editor, I thought, you know, you're absolutely right. It's the wrong thing to do in terms of how the book works.
My editor, I wanted to stop listing all of Henry VIII's executions because they really get kind of boring after a while. And she said, no, you have to have them in. You don't have to describe them in detail. You can say the usual felon's death, but otherwise people will say, well, no wonder he's likable. You're just whitewashing him. You left out half of the unsavory things that he did. And I think also if you do have a character who's done, you know, bad things, it's true, it's cheating if you leave them out so they'll be likable, but it does make you a little squeamish to have to include them.
Yeah, I mean, I think I came up with that issue particularly writing about Mary Tudor, who we know 280 people burned during her 4-year reign. But, you know, also, I mean, there are a lot of deaths at Elizabeth's hands, and she's not called Bloody Elizabeth, but, you know, that's another story. And I think what my challenge was I didn't want to buy into this idea of Bloody Mary, she's a wicked woman, you know, that it's much, much more complex than that. To us, it's a horrendous taboo, the idea of having 280 people burnt. But to her, I wanted to somehow try and demonstrate in Sisters of Treason, which are these two young girls living at her court, having to sort of negotiate their way around it and pretend to be Catholic. And I wanted to show her as somebody to whom this made complete moral sense in terms of her faith, and she believed it was the thing that the monarch of England had to do to bring England back into the fold. So she felt it was for the good of her people. And I think that's where you get this tension between how we perceive her now and what she did, and how she has to be within that book. And I mean, that for me was very, very interesting, trying to get beneath her skin and understand. I mean, she doesn't come over particularly well, but I wanted her to be fully human. as someone making those decisions, not because she's a tyrant, and I think perhaps her father was much more of a tyrant. I think his motives and the way he had to sort of get to do some sort of moral gymnastics to justify his actions, whereas I think Mary had 100% religious justification for her actions, and that made her believe she had God on her side, and I think that's just, it makes it interesting. It makes her interesting, and it makes it interesting, I think, for contemporary readers. Yeah.
I think for me, it's the violence, which is well, pretty endemic in all of our periods, actually, and even now. But it was very difficult to know how far to go with some of the. I mean, and I have many battle scenes and sieges and torture and executions that take place across the 6 novels that I've written, and I was always sort of dancing across the sort of line between not wanting to do a disservice to history and to the people that fought these wars and experienced these horrific things, but then also not desensitizing my readers and not getting to that, oh God, another page of blood and eyeballs flying everywhere. And I think it's quite a tricky one to play. I mean, one of the first battles that I had in the Brethren trilogy involved the Mongol army, incredibly bloodthirsty, using captured women and children as slaves. As part of a shield wall, so that then the men on the opposite side would have to kill their own wives and daughters to get through to the enemy behind, and that there were sort of eyewitness accounts of babies being stabbed in the street, and I dance as close to that as I think I can, while still making it true and real, but whilst not sort of over-egging it too much, and sort of it is difficult. There were 2 scenes in particular with the Insurrection trilogy that I found incredibly difficult to write, but I decided to go pretty much the whole way with both of them because they were both important in their own way. One is that the very bloody, dreadful siege of Berwick, which is one of the first towns to fall when war breaks out between England and Scotland. Edward rides in. It's again another one of those streets running red. The River Tweed was said to run red with blood. Slaughter went on for 3 days, and it was many women and children were the ones being slaughtered because the leaders had actually barricaded themselves in a castle at this point. So and in fact the men were at this point, certainly in terms of the fighting men, were the ones who were saved after that battle because they surrendered, and the code of chivalry meant that they were safe. But the poor men in the street and the women and children were gone. But the battle was said to have stopped when King Edward was riding through the streets on the 3rd day, I think it was, of this awful slaughter and looting and rape and pillage and whatever else was going on. And he saw a pregnant woman in labour, in the act of giving birth, being hacked to death by one of his soldiers, and that turned even him off. And so he put a stop to the violence on that day. And it was a horrible scene to write. I know from readers' reactions that it's a pretty horrible scene to read as well. And the next one was Wallace's execution, which is incredibly bloody, and Braveheart doesn't even touch how disgusting it really was. And I did feel you sort of come away from that almost feeling slightly traumatised yourself. But there are certain points where I think you have to go all the way, and hope that your readers will just trust you to go with you, because this is about authenticity rather than sensationalist violence.
Sex, I suppose, is the big one. I really don't like writing about sex. It causes so many problems. And I wrote a book called The American Boy, which is a Regency novel, and I have on the hard drive of my computer a deleted chapter where my hero, who's also my narrator, has sex with a particular woman, a lady, a married woman. And my God, I researched so much about Regency underclothes, such as they were. And it took me weeks to sort of write this chapter. And I showed my wife, who sees everything I write, and she said, "Darling, you just can't use this." And she was absolutely right. It was not only I think the crassest piece of writing I've ever done, but also in terms of a first-person narrator, a Regency young man of some education who actually loved this woman, the last thing he would do in what was meant to be a personal narrative, he wouldn't actually write it down. Okay. He sort of hinted it with all sorts of classical sort of hints and allusions. Yeah. But the other thing, again, which I found very, very hard, was when I wrote a scene in which a mother woke up from a drugged sleep the morning after her little child had been kidnapped, a 4-year-old child, her 4-year-old daughter. And at the time, we had 4-year-old children ourselves. And that scene was the worst I've ever had to write, even worse than the sex scene. My wife and I kept sending it between ourselves, trying to get it right, trying to be honest, because the only way to do it was to think, how would we feel if we'd been in that situation? And if you actually go there and think it through, it's not a happy place to be.
Horrible.
Yeah.
Okay, can we take a couple of questions from the audience?
Hello, Elizabeth Fremantle. I'm a bit bothered about the genuineness of the belief of the violence of the thing. Hitler genuinely believed that he was doing the world a service to completely exterminate all the Jews. Do you think in 500 years' time, if humanity is still alive, some novelists will be writing such a novel saying, that he really genuinely believed it, and therefore I have to go into all these details because he really genuinely believed it. What do you think I'm getting wrong in the stick now?
Question about the justification of violence for Elizabeth.
No, I must have not been very clear when I said I don't seek to justify Mary Tudor's actions in the novel at all, but I seek to understand how she came to sanction so much violence and why there wasn't moral outrage, which there wasn't. It was accepted that it was something that had to be done, and I think you have to get in and under the skin of the characters and the period to understand how that is possible. And I think Hitler's a good example because he really felt he was doing the right thing. He felt that eugenics and the creating a master race was a good thing, and he convinced a lot of people. I think I've never thought about parallels between someone. It's fanatical behaviour, and I think Mary Tudor was fanatical, and I think, but it doesn't make her. It doesn't mean we should dismiss her. It means we should try and understand what was happening, to understand it within the context of that society as well. I mean, when we look at. People continue to commit terrible things, and we only have to look at what's been happening in the Middle East. But we look at, so for example, I think you look at moral outrage, and you look at all those children being killed, women and children being killed in Gaza recently. International moral outrage. Whereas there are times in the past when women and children were killed, what are the things you were talking about? No moral outrage. It's like, well, if that's the best way to win, then that's what we do. And so I think we, as people who write about history, have to face those monstrous things head on to try and understand them. It doesn't mean I would never seek to justify those things, because it's certainly something that I am outraged by. But I do think it's important to look at it from all dimensions.
And I think you're being dishonest as a writer if you don't convey their justification. It's not being honest to the era if you do just say, well, Mary Queen of Scots was mad, as it were, because clearly she wasn't, and that doesn't have to mean that you approve of it in any way. I mean, I think there is a risk if you start. Well, you have to deal with the fact that you want to convey both the justification and the fact that that was then, and that was her. But you're also not making the proper connection with nowadays. If you say, well, they were bad, that was just then, that was so. You actually, if you're trying to make any, say, kind of connection between Mary burning people and what goes on in certain theatres of, trouble now, you're actually not going to make the connection if you devalue what happened then, if you make it less than serious. And less than convincing is the way that humans behave. If you're trying to make a point about the way, does that make any sense at all? Sorry, it doesn't feel as if it does. Anyway, I'll stop there.
Anybody else like to pitch in? No?
Well, I think moral outrage, with the benefit of hindsight, it's quite an easy thing to go for, isn't it? It pleases the crowd, in a way. It's much more interesting, I think, for all of us as historical novelists to try and understand how people did what they did, rather than to wave a disapproving finger at them.
Yeah, I think it's it's not really the job of fiction writers to make judgments. It's for us to ask questions actually about the big issues, and I would say
yes, it's to try and bring greater understanding, isn't it?
Yeah.
Another question from the audience?
There's something.
I just wanted to piggyback on what both of you were saying. I think, if I understand correctly, it's about providing a rationale for the characters' actions as opposed to trying to get the audience to empathize.
Yes.
Yeah. Because unless the person is absolutely insane or mad, they had a reason for doing what they were doing, no matter how repugnant or horrible the reason was. And if that is your central character, you have to try to present this person in the larger sense so that we understand every inch of the person. It doesn't mean that we like every inch of the person or can even put ourselves in their place in terms of what it is that they did. But we're providing a reason, no matter how ugly the reason is.
And actually, to get readers to think, yes, if I put myself in her place, I can kind of see how that would have happened, is also quite good for readers. Actually, it is much easier to have a bogeyman. It's much more comfortable for us to think of them as bogeymen.
Yeah, we
to say, actually,
polarize.
if I was there, I cannot swear, given what religious faith or whatever was going, I cannot swear I would not have done that.
Yeah. Also,
purposes of reading is to get a person to not. It's not just simply for enjoyment. It's to have us grapple with the larger issues.
Yes,
and to
the
really
dark
think.
side, to visit the dark side. And I think, I think it's unhelpful to look at monstrous figures from the past, so Hitler's a very good example, and just say, dismiss him, he was mad, because that,
It's easy. But
also, it's very easy for then us to just say, well, he was just mad, so it doesn't really matter. It's much worse to look and understand the real sort of his rationale and think, well, that happened because he thought in this way and he followed these particular scientific investigations and he came to these conclusions in a rational way rather than, well, he was just mad, so we'll dismiss it.
But also he has a social context as well. I mean, Hitler in another society that didn't have particular things would not necessarily have ended up as it did. The society which gives rise to these people is also culpable. And again, if you just say, well, he's mad, then that lets society off.
Yeah, it lets
that's a
everybody
very good
off.
point. If you think in terms of the Holocaust, it was
Hitler's
handled
willing
in such a
executioners.
Teutonic way. Bureaucracy. All of it happened off stage. They were just sort of saying, 16 will die here, 5,000 will die there. Numbers on a page.
Yeah.
And who else around Mary Tudor was making it happen?
Yeah.
Well,
yes.
yeah,
I blame the Pope
Cardinal
myself.
Pole.
Well, and the whole set.
And
I've
the
just read
bishops,
down at
yeah.
McCulloch on the Reformation. It's actually, these things arise in a context. They never land from outer space, and it behoves us to say, how did Syria come about?
Yeah.
Well, that's true. I mean, the McCarthy era in the U.S., that obsession about communism and that we were, had to be on the lookout against it and we've been infiltrated and perfectly normal people sort of caught this fever and because he didn't exist in a vacuum either.
Yeah, and I think it's just because we can find a personal rationale within a character we're writing about, it doesn't mean we approve or that it's right in any way.
Think of Giles's Viking, you know, the rapist Viking. You could have made the Viking gay, I suppose. That might have been a way around it.
I got taken terribly to task on the blogs for making Anthony Woodville gay.
Yes, nobody liked it.
It's actually the most successful relationship in the book.
Bless.
I think we've also got to consider what you're using this for in the story, because it's the story that's the most important thing. And if you're using it for the wrong reasons, the reader is not going to like it. If you're using it for the right reasons, then the whole moral issue becomes unimportant. It's not there.
Okay. I shall open another can of worms here. We can't have a big debate about freedom and independence without mentioning the Scottish Referendum, which takes place in a couple of weeks from now. From a personal point of view, you know, as a Scot, I can understand the tug of the heartstrings, you know, to try and overturn history. But I haven't read or heard anything that feels like a reason to end a union, however flawed, that's provided 300 years of peace and prosperity. And I think that's a big issue. I'd like to hear what the panel think about the current situation. And then I'm kind of planning to have a mini referendum. So we'll have a show of hands. Once you hear what they say, we'll have a show of hands. So, Andrew, do you want to...
Well, I'm not a Scot, first. I have no right to say anything on this, really, in one way. But I do feel I would hugely regret the breakup of the United Kingdom any further. And I think England and Scotland have been so closely intertwined. To tear us apart now would be enormously painful for both sides. I think there would be no winners in this in the long run. There would be two losers.
Robyn?
Oh, goodness. I mean, I've been sort of backwards and forwards to Scotland really since it first started being properly talked about, and I've seen a real change in atmosphere, not in a good way, I have to say. I've been sort of speaking to a lot of people at festivals and, you know, in bars and at hotels, and at first there was just a sense of, well, we don't know how we're going to vote because we have no information whatsoever. That was, you know, the general line for probably up until about a year ago, after I think the white paper was about a year or so. After that, it started getting more polarised and more divisive, up to a point now where I think what's going to be interesting, everyone keeps sort of saying to me at events here in England and in Scotland as well, which way do you think it's going to go? And I would have said about 6 months ago, I think it's going to be a no. I think now it's going to be very close to call. But I think what I find so worrying is that it's not just sort of brought up a sort of Scottish nationalism as opposed to England, and all of the sort of nastiness that goes with that. It's also on the English side as well, and it seems to be feeding into English nationalism in a very, for me, I find very worrying way. And then you've got the division in Scotland itself. And I was listening to, I think Alex Hammond a while ago was on the Today programme, and James Naughtie said, compared him to a new Robert Bruce, and I fancied sort of phoning in and going, well, yes, but Robert caused civil war in Scotland before he even came anywhere near independence. So I think it's a very divisive thing. Personally, I do actually understand, speaking to a lot of Scots, why there is a yes sentiment out there, very much the sort of feeling of feeling incredibly alienated from London and Westminster. But I was with a few novelists talking about this over lunch yesterday, and but you get that feeling in Cornwall and in Yorkshire and in Forest of Dean and in Wales and in Ireland. So it's not just a Scottish question or a sense of alienation. Sorry, I could talk about this for hours, so I'll shut up. But I personally would be incredibly sad if the union split.
Margaret?
Well, obviously I'm not Scottish, but my family was Scottish. couple of centuries ago, and Scott, McMullen, Glasson, but looking at it from the outside, really, it does seem that you can't turn the clock backward with history, really, and it seems it would be very impractical on both sides. And I thought the Scots were supposed to be very practical and hard-headed, at least when it came to money. And I think economically, it would be a real loss for both sides. I understand the emotional part of it. After all, the Americans decided they wanted to be free. So you can sort of understand, but really on a practical and many other ways looking at it, it just seems to be a negative. I would be sad if they voted yes myself, and it seems kind of ill-advised. But again, I'm not a citizen here.
I'm not a Scot either, though I do have Scottish forebears. I've also got Irish forebears. Proper English person, absolutely almost no English blood whatsoever if you go far enough back. As an English person, I dread what would happen to the House of Commons if we didn't have all those Scottish Labour MPs. I do also think that it doesn't always work terribly well, but on the other hand, I rather agree with Andrew that I don't think either of us really know what it would be like without. I think both actually would suffer more than we think. And I mean, also going back to Bruce, the other thing is that's all happening before the proper idea of the nation state. It doesn't really work.
Yeah, absolutely.
You cannot map backwards.
No. Nationalism is such a poisonous drug.
It's a poisonous drug, and also it's a very modern drug.
Yeah.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
And we make our national myths to try and understand it, and actually we make our national myths in our own image.
Yeah. With the benefit of hindsight.
Yes.
With the benefit of very selective hindsight. So I'm basically just hoping for a no, but I agree, as far as I've read, it seems very close either way.
Oh, well, I'm not Scottish and either.
So we're a complete lot of frauds here.
Except most of us are slightly Scottish.
I think there's a great metaphor used in I'm going to sound like a real kind of literary suit here, from a Tom Stoppard play called Arcadia. And he says, you can't unstir the jam from the rice pudding. And for me, I don't get how it will work. It just doesn't seem to make that much sense to me. I can understand why it's like a sort of gesture to allow people to make a choice about it, but then you think about, well, what about all those people living on the border? The English people living just over the border, what about their identity? And I don't get it, I'm afraid.
There's a fair consensus on the panel, I think. Any contributions from the floor?
I'll make a contribution from a Canadian context. Yes. Because we had a vote, oh God, I can't even remember what year it was, 1999, I believe, when it was supposed to... Yeah, right. Thank you, Sally.
The one that almost missed by a tenth of a percent.
Yes, exactly. It was like 49.6% wanted to separate from Canada. And I'll tell you, it was just so emotional. I think everybody was quite glad. Certainly the English were very glad not to lose that part of our heritage. So just a little, I mean, how would you take apart a country by taking one province out of it? Plus the fact that the native Indian population in Canada, I know that's the wrong way to refer to them, they didn't want to separate either. Anyway, a little context.
I have a fear that this is more about Alexander's desire for authority and power over his country. And I have another fear that I watched recently, the rise of the nationalist thug in Scotland.
Yes.
And I fear that that's what it might become if Scotland takes independence. That the thugs may take over. And Scotland will indeed rule what's happening.
To be fair, there's been thuggery on both sides.
Yeah.
But these debates breed it.
Yeah, well, I just say I'm Irish. Untitled Chapter 802. It's brilliant.
There is the little matter of Glasgow, I guess. I'd just like to say that in 1707, the Referendum of the Finance
it's actually forced from the Scots. It's not really a democratic decision of the Scots to form the Union in 1707. So for 300 years, Scotland has been part of the Union that it didn't really elect, as we know it, democratically.
Point made.
I'll give you Northern Irish perspective. I think we have some experience. I can choose a British or an Irish passport. I chose an Irish. I value that very much. I wouldn't choose a British passport. I didn't. However, nationalism as a modern drug, I fear what might arise. I dislike what happened in Northern Ireland over 30 years and longer. Stirring up passions like that will take decades, if not centuries, to resolve and reach a new equilibrium.
Well, let's have a vote then.
There's a question over there.
There's from Canada about how emotional separation is. And I think that is kind of how I feel personally. I think probably a lot of people also agree. It is at base an emotion issue. The Scots don't feel that they're part of Westminster. They don't feel that they're part of the United Kingdom. I'm not saying the Scots generally, I'm saying the big escalated. And I think that's probably what I would say. I personally I'm always identified with being British. I have Scottish blood, I have English blood, I have Welsh blood. I wasn't even born here, so I always consider myself to be British. I think that is the issue. There is an emotional detachment or distance between the Scots and the idea of Britain.
What country one belongs to some extent, at an emotional level, it's where you live, and I live very comfortably here in London, and the size of the body politic to which I belong is an administrative issue. As far as what do I belong to, this administrative issue, surely that's a matter of the date. Didn't we all crawl out of the old of our gourd, something nearby, according to the geneticists? You go back far enough, the human race came out of Africa. We're all one species. What's all this? Why can't we? And you take nationalism out of its bottle, it's very hard to put back again. Look at the Welsh and all the cottage burning because they didn't like people who spoke English. It's terribly difficult to calm people down, but it's nothing to do with the reality of it. There's some kind of, this is my space, and you're an invader at a visceral level rather than anything.
I want independence for inside the M25.
You can have it.
Inside the North Circular.
I think we've heard
I think it's time for a vote. I think we could carry on. I personally feel absolutely passionate about this issue. I think lots of us do, but I think we have to round it up now.
Right, okay.
So a vote?
Right. Should Scotland leave the United Kingdom? Yes. Yeah. 4 or 5, 6, yeah. No. Yeah, fairly clear majority, yeah. But
we don't get to vote.
I think it'll be closer than that on September the 18th.
Thanks so much. That's that's been moving and well argued on so many levels. But thank you.